sounds off. It's just a little bit easier for me to hear without the echo. So Farming Smarter, a SOLS project for the next generation. I've spent 30 years now working with landholders, and this project was an amazing opportunity to use a background in soil science and also extension, and to work with landholders on issues of sustainability. So just trying to go to the next page there, Robin. Okay, all right, it was just a lag. Okay, so this particular project, it's $2 million project funded by National Land Care Program, as Joe said, and it was designed and supported by Riverina Local Land Services to be delivered over 5 years. So $800,000 of that $2 million goes straight to landholders to achieve contracted outcomes, environmental outcomes. And there's a buy-in from the landholders. So they're contributing 60 to 65% of their own funds to the project. And the type of in-kind contributions, often these sort of projects are labour, but in this case, they're all capital based. So any in-kind contributions of labour or time are on top of it. So they are contributing very significantly to these environmental outcomes. We chose to work with 163 landholders on this project over the 5 years. So I'm up to about 118 landholders. So it makes for interesting phone time amongst the other things that we're doing. What we wanted to do was we wanted to change the discussions on farm and the decisions on farm, and to use data in a way where it was not just another layer of data adding more complexity and delaying decisions, but to make the decisions real time and to occur within this 5-year delivery of the project. So I'm just on to the next slide, Robin, but it's quite slow. So I wanted to put some context to who we are. No, it's gone and skipped one. I'll go back up. There is a lag. Joe, welcome for your input if there's another way for me to go to the slides a little bit more easily. Okay, so while I'm waiting to go back to the previous slide, I'm just showing you some of the customers we work with. Interestingly, I find that it's very sort of gender neutral, that we have as many female landholders working with us as male landholders. Whether that's because there's a focus on environmental outcomes, I'm not sure. Now, I really need to go back to that last page. It's not, this arrow is not working at all. Okay, no. Okay, so that was where I was trying to get back to. In terms of who I work with Riverina Local Land Services, and we are in the public sector. So it's our business to deliver environmental services and to achieve environmental outcomes. We tender for these funds in competition with other service providers, and think of it like a not-for-profit model where we are actually trying to put as many of the funding dollars into the growers' pockets to actually achieve the environmental services. We're legislated to have many functions, and these include 2 of those in the areas that I work in: an advisory and extension service and natural resource management. We collaborate with many other agencies, including universities and other government services. And just in the Riverina, it's a large region, and our customer base is approximately 14,000 landholders in the region. So we addressed with the funding body originally some of their, like a priority area, if you like, which was the eastern and southern Riverina. which had been identified as an area vulnerable to soil erosion, both wind and hill slope erosion, and also acidification. And there was a need for, if you like, a refreshing of data, that some of the data in this space was 20 to 30 years old, and it was time to revisit it when you have funding bodies that are working out national and state and regional priorities. So, as I mentioned before, 163 landholders, but just years 1 and 2 were 81 participants in, with 167 paddocks, and focusing our efforts between that 500 to 800 mil rainfall zone. So what are we doing? Well, we're mapping pH in calcium chloride and cation exchange capacity. So we're looking at that, if you like, pantry of nutrients in the soil bank, and how that's impacting on the pH and the buffering capacity of the soil and its capacity to resist pH change or not. And we're looking closely at exchangeable acidity, including aluminium, which has a bearing on plant growth, being toxic to plant growth. So the project goals, well, firstly, we are engaging our next generation of land managers and landholders. So there's definitely a nice proportion of younger growers. They're often the applicants working in farming businesses. Really, we're engaging all generations of land managers, and to looking at managing the hill slope and wind erosion, ground cover protection, soil acidification, soil fertility, and soil carbon. None of these things are any less important than each other. We're really looking at farm sustainability and measuring a number of these. So we develop a working document, which is a property, soil, nutrient and liming plan. And interestingly, it's not just a text-based thing. So there's a word that's crept into everyone's language today, which is visualization. And when we start talking about data and massive amounts of data, to me, it's really important that people are able to visualize and feel this story and see this story, and that it's that visualization that actually translates into decision making. So we want lime use and we want long-term amelioration of soil acidity. So to me, you know, when you put a time frame on sustainability, you could take that short, medium or long term. We all think it's long term. You've got to make lots of decisions in the interim to actually get there, focusing on the outcome at the end. And there really is no end point with sustainability. It's ongoing. So we want to increase the awareness and understanding of soil acidification processes. You know, if you took 30 children or 30 adults and said, how many of you are passionate about soil chemistry? You might get one or two put their hand up. So it's very much about making this real. Management options, because let's face it, farmers are great at making decisions. They have to every day. They manage many risks, business, seasonal, commodity pricing, all their risks. The adoption of targeted and strategic soil testing. We want to increase the area of productive and persistent perennial pastures. We want to increase ground cover and better manage these risks of erosion. So I mentioned soil acidity before. What does it actually look like? We can't talk about managing a soil constraint if you can't actually see it. And so because we're talking about the pH of a soil and the aluminium toxicity of a soil, we actually need to look at what's happening in the plant world as a result of it. And so that particular photo there, we're looking at some weeds that are sort of quite acid loving, that are growing at the expense of other things that could be growing there instead. And so thinking big picture with these things, that when we actually have threatening processes like acidification, farming systems can't reach their rain limited potential. Plant-based systems can't reach their genetic potential or their fertilised potential. That we have labour and capital resources on the farm, that if we have a choke in one area in terms of productivity, that we're also not best using that labour and that capital. And so we have many plant-based systems, including exotic, naturalised and native species that are sensitive to acidity constraints. And then other, weeds proliferate, and these things add very direct cost to farming systems. So when we start a dialogue like this and talk about management and decisions, there's people who want to know the why again before we get into the how. They're both interesting conversations, but to take that blame out of it, we need to work with landholders so that they well understand that no one's blaming anyone in terms of how we got to this place, and they usually want to know why, how we got here before you talk about where we're actually going to go with it. So is it conventional practices? And when I look across, and there's lots of chemistry on this page, but when I actually look at it, we have this net export of alkalinity out the farm gate. So it doesn't matter what we're growing. It can be the tons of grain or hay or silage, or it can be the kilos of meat or wool. But at the end of the day, we grow things. So we're harvesting sunshine and water, and we're exporting all of it out of the farm gate. And that's the business that we're actually in. So we try and balance that production with agricultural inputs. And for that, we're refining and tinkering and managing and adjusting and innovating. But there is no getting aside from the fact that if we have product leaving the farm gate, that it actually comes at a cost. So there is a little bit of science in this. Well, actually, there's probably a lot behind the scenes in terms of published scientific work that we can utilise that's been done by my mentors, counterparts, other people. So we want the farmers to understand the soil pH because what we want to do when we're talking about changes is we want them to look back and reflect on previous management decisions. And you don't change something that you think is working for you. If you're comfortable with the status quo, then you actually stay there. But agriculture is constantly innovating and updating, and growers have a great capacity to change when there's a motivation to do so. So when we have a look at it and we understand that soil pH is very variable in the paddock, and that we can show them that by looking at it between 1 and 4 paddocks on their actual property, and then we can look at the difference between the minimum and the maximum pH and what happens when you start managing the average of that, and recognising where that line in the sand is, if you like, with the aluminium toxicity, you start actually making sense of the numbers. So we use a methodology called dual depth sampling. We could have used an alternative methodology, but I'm happy with the one that we chose. And again, while I'm talking about acidification, it's recognised by scientists within this region that I work in. This is a major constraint. So it doesn't matter if we're producing pastures or crops, this is the major constraint. And in the past, we've addressed it by liming the topsoil, but we all know that minimum and zero tillage have been really popular farming systems. So farmers are not necessarily incorporating the lime, and that this layer below the topsoil is not commonly disturbed. And if we're also just as mindful of soil erosion risk, then we don't want to disturb it. We don't want to risk losing our soil. So to take you into a paddock, if you like, here's a transect where someone would have commonly gone and collected cores and worked out what their average pH and also fertility was in the paddock. The W that I've just overlaid it is like another, you can walk in a W or you can walk in a straight line. You wouldn't do both, you would have done one or the other in the past. And then this next diagram is showing that if we take a grid sampling approach, we're actually trying to pick up as much variability across the whole paddock, because our management decision manages the whole paddock. It wasn't just to suit that straight line or that W transect where we actually collected cores from and had data from. my touch screen there. So from one paddock, it was soil sampling, 50 hectares for different people. That's either 1, 2, 3 or 4 paddocks, 25 grids, 25 different soil stories, one for each grid. And then we put a number of goal-based options in front of people to consider so they have a choice. But we make one informed and strategic management decision. Which one they choose depends on capital, timing, what they're actually doing in that paddock. And it's just one decision at one point of time. It doesn't mean they won't readdress it and come back and do something else in 2 to 5 years' time. Now, I wanted to show you this because to me, this is not visualization. This is what soil data can commonly look at. We can set a line over on our axis on the left, the y-axis of 5.5, and I can tell you quite convincingly that that's the optimum pH for plant growth, and that's where I'd like these paddocks to actually be at if it was consistent in that growing medium or what we call our soil. What you'll see is there's a lot of paddocks. So any one particular line going up and down is just the minimum to maximum, that range within a paddock. And so there's an awful lot of our paddocks in the project that are below the 5.5 line. The red line is a lower target where we're just trying to get rid of the aluminium toxicity constraint. So as I said, that's the type of data that's hard for farmers to visualise making changes with. But here we'll go and take one paddock and our topsoil on the left and our subsurface 10 to 20 centimetres below on the right-hand side. And all of a sudden that pH and cation exchange capacity data becomes real. So the brown, which is not reflected on this particular paddock, is severely acidic, below 4.2. Red's not good, pink's not good, and it's sort of building up to green and blues being good, but the colour allows us to visualise it, and then when consistent across all project paddocks. And what one would typically see, I'll show you a few more later, is in some paddocks, the subsurface is more or less acidic than the top. They're very rarely the same. And the subsurface is something that people have not necessarily, they might have looked at it once before. They're not managing that when it's not real and they're just numbers. So here we have some numbers, and I really just want to show you that range. So across those paddocks in just 2 years, minimum of 3.78, severely acidic, a maximum of 7.1, sort of like a neutral pH, range of 3.33. In soil chemistry terms, the level of acidity is magnified many, many times. Strictly speaking, you'd say 1,000, but the optimum being 5.5. What you will see is that there's a lot of paddocks that fall below. And like I said, in terms of how we use resources in agriculture, if we're not operating where the pH is optimum, then we're not using our resources as well as what we could, or there's just a whole lot of scope for improvement. Now, another way of looking at the paddocks that we actually sampled, and they were not deliberate in that we didn't go out and say, please nominate your most acidic paddocks on the farm. It wasn't like that at all. Everything that has a pH below 4.6 is going into potential aluminium toxicity territory. And there's a lot of paddocks that are over there on that left below 4.6. Aluminium higher than 5% costs us in productivity terms with plant sensitivity and also the nitrogen cycle. So rhizobia are very sensitive to low soil pH, and they don't function as well. So there's not very many free lunches in agriculture. We pay for our inputs, but if you like, when we look at rhizobia on legumes, they're actively fixing nitrogen out of our atmosphere, which is nitrogen rich, and they're able to do that for us. That's about the only free lunch that we ever actually get in agriculture. But if they're impacted by acidity, then they're not actually functioning to their best either. And so you've got all of those paddocks there with an aluminium percentage higher than 5, big plethora on that graph, that are all there impacted by this constraint again. Okay, now we don't just talk about pH. pH impacts on soil fertility, so nutrients are less available at low soil pH in most cases, the type of nutrients that we actually pay for. So we go through them one by one and we tell the story in terms of either what's at adequate healthy levels or what's lacking. And I'll just quickly show you there. Minimum of 6 with phosphorus, maximum of 120. You know, I only need a pasture paddock to be sort of around that 25 to 30. Cropping paddocks would be about double, but it's easy to get this out of balance. And so that's the type of decision where growers can be spending more on fertiliser for all of the right reasons, and we actually needed them to be investing more in lime. Anyway, the other one I'll quickly talk about though is carbon. So if you look at the minimum there of 0.55, that's a very low organic carbon in a paddock, well below optimum. Benchmark is 2%, and it would be nicer if it was higher. Maximum of 5.6. That's a tenfold difference in the type of organic carbon that's being stored just in these project paddocks. So we have a lot of upside in agriculture. And if we're looking at food security, you know, I like to believe the glass is half full rather than half empty. There is so much scope to improve productivity, but again, it's about doing it in that sustainable way. And some of those things I talked about at the beginning about decreasing our erosion risk and increasing soil fertility and improving soil pH, but using perenniality, using grazing systems that are more sustainable. There's lots of scope here to go on the upside to make things better, being mindful of not actually increasing our risks. And again, if you were an audience of soil scientists, there's lots of fascinating stories in the data, but I will flick over them. And what I wanted to show you is when we're talking about the visualization at the grid level in a paddock, and farmers know their paddocks really well. They know that little bit that always gets wet. They know that bit over in the corner that, you know, doesn't yield well. They know the bit up on the ridge line that always sort of yields and doesn't let them down. They have all these little stories within a paddock. And when you go and show them the pH story, takes a little bit to get your head around it first, but they'll start reflecting on not just months of observations, but decades of observations of what they're seeing. And this is also a good conversation to have between the different generations on that farm, to actually hear these stories, because sometimes they are in someone's head and that they haven't been told to the younger generation. And so there's two different stories there, the two different depths. And then we start thinking thinking about colour, about, you know, is what's happening underneath the same as on the top, not as good as, better than, and how does that influence the decision that comes after it? So just want to be careful I didn't miss it. No, I didn't miss a slide. Why set goals for landholders? So in this space of soil pH and also lime rates, my question back to you firstly would be, how do you achieve a goal, particularly in the environmental outcomes and the sustainability, if you don't actually set it? If it becomes philosophical in nature, where you just want to strive for something or do better, then it's not numerical, it's not targeted. It's a feel-good thing, but it's very, how do you say, up to the individual to decide whether they're actually doing better than what they were, and how do you compare it? So we do try and set goals within this project, and we offer landholders this on-farm data of the paddocks that they know best, with this sort of scientific approach and advisory support. And so we always give them a range of options. So we have 2 pH targets, and then we have a whole lot of sort of optimums for our soil fertility. The other thing is that we do get into the chemistry a little bit, and we talk about, for their particular paddock, is the acidity moving deeper down the profile, and what are they going to need to actually do about that to stop that? So acidification is ongoing. It doesn't stop just because you lime a paddock once, and you do need to understand, it gets a little bit technical, but they understand it well, that lime itself doesn't move. So there's no simple answers. It takes time, and it takes putting enough lime on in the first place. Now, you can go back and have a read there later if you like, but many participants choose to adopt above the minimum, so to actually look at these higher pH targets with their agronomist or consultant and about what they're trying to achieve in the long term. These two are actually, so we had the pH maps before for the 2 different depths. These are variable rate lime application maps. And so there's enough detail down at the bottom. There's a very real quantity of lime that they're going to use. It means they work with a contractor who does variable rate, often for the first time, and they can see how much of their paddock needed how much. And then before the 5 years is up, we're going to come back and resample a proportion of participants so that we can go back and measure what this achieved and show everyone as sort of a group learning. So our third and final map, and we have some people who adopt this who are quite happy to, is our aspirational map. How much would we need for both of the sample depths to be able to lift the pH so that we slowed that reacidification right down and we stopped it moving any deeper down the soil profile? And it involves reallocating lime. So thinking about that resource that we use, it's costly. Lime is still about $70 a tonne, plus the spreading costs, and reallocating that to the areas of the paddock that need it most. So there is lots of science behind this, and New South Wales DPI, Department of Primary Industries, who I spent about 20 years with before Local Land Services, have some great extension materials that can support some of these decisions in terms of why we use a quantity of lime that we do. Now, this wasn't just about using more lime. This was actually about increasing perenniality and getting more pastures, better pastures that are less weedy pastures that are going to last longer and persist for longer. And so once we've gone past the variable rate lime application decision, then we're looking at establishing pastures, perennial pastures. And 2020 was a great year. That pasture that we just looked at a moment ago could have looked like a crop from the road. It was bountiful, it was growing well, it was healthy, and the growers would hope that it's going to be there for many years to come. That's a pasture. What you see is a lot of bare ground there that's only in the initial months after it's been established, and that will quickly grow beyond that so that there's a canopy closure. And our participants work with their existing agronomists and consultants. So this is some of the feedback from the landholders in this project. So when they think about investing in their pastures and investing in more lime, they are challenged by the seasons sometimes, but it's a serious investment. It's sort of, we're talking about, on average $300 per hectare to establish the new pasture, plus their lime. If that's around 3 tonne per hectare, that's another 210 plus spreading costs. So we're talking about investment decisions in the order of $500 to $600 per hectare. Using variable rate for the first time, you know, a grower there from Marengo, they thought it would tell them to use more lime. This is in the precision ag space. They actually needed less. Those sort of individual findings, they differ. But what people find is their perspectives are changed once they've actually adopted the change, that you really only learn by doing, and everybody gets something different out of it. Blanket rates of lime won't address the worst parts of the paddock. They also won't keep up with existing reacidification in most cases. And that subsurface acidity is like a serious constraint when people thought they were doing a really good job on the topsoil. So happy to open it up to questions. And that's about it from me, other than it's been an amazing project to work within and to work with so many landholders. And as I said, the generations across farms and the different perspectives about sustainability. But I'm always heartened by the very positive sort of feeling that growers really do strive for sustainability, and they appreciate data as long as it doesn't make the decisions more complex, because at the end of the day, you want more data to make something simpler or more transparent. And we've tried to do that with this project.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to press 2 buttons to be heard again. Thank you, Lisa. That was really amazing. I think it's most profound what you said. How do you achieve a goal if you don't set it? And I guess that's the sum of the day, really, is what our discussions and our discussions lead to what goals later on. But it was amazing to see it applied in the field. And I guess where we're talking about is, and I totally agree, seeing it in multiple colours for me visually makes a much bigger difference in translation and understanding. And I think, you know, my vision is to see it further and have, you know, an image of whatever DP number that was, and then the colours over the top of that, and you can see, you know, how things are growing and see the nutrients that's in that pasture. So yeah, it's a huge opportunity, and what you're doing is just amazing. Tim Gentle stated, one clear advantage of this scientific data available is for corporate farms that don't have the benefit of generational knowledge and exchange. Do you find that a lot? Do you find that maybe it's the corporate farms that are taking on this data more than people that have?
Yeah, look, we have a few corporate farms who are participants. I've also been well supported by the agronomist farmers, so the generation of farmers that have gone and done their Bachelor of Agricultural Science and come back to the farm. And there's a lot of, you know, farming is big business. Not only is it multi-generation, but in most cases they're multi-million-dollar businesses. And that while everyone talks about lifestyle, we are talking about businesses on a daily basis. So the corporate farms, if you like, there's a different level. Sometimes they're bigger farms, not always. It's just that you have city and country-based investors who've chosen to invest in agriculture other than, say, the family farm model. So in terms of the generational knowledge, I would say, you know, the managers of corporate farms are certainly expected to keep up with data. So the only difference would be if a farm's changing hands. But some of the corporate farms have been there for a long time.